blueprints hit the kitchen floor like a verdict. "This is what you do all day?" my sister-in-law said, not even looking at me when she said it. She was already stepping over the pages, heading to the fridge like she owned the place, which technically she did not, but you'd never know it by the way she moved through my home. Her name is Felicity, my husband's younger sister. She arrived at our door in October with 2 suitcases and a story about her landlord raising rent on short notice, and my husband, kind, loyal, impossible to say no to Gavin, looked at me with those eyes and said, "Just for a couple months, Sarah. She has nowhere to go." My name is Serena Aldcroft. I'm 31. I work from home as a structural designer, freelance, mostly commercial renovation projects, the kind of retrofitting work that keeps old buildings standing another 50 years. My studio is the second bedroom of our townhouse in Hamilton, Ontario, or it was, before Felicity turned it into her personal lounge. That October morning, when the blueprints hit the floor, it had been 4 months. 4 months of working from home isn't really working, delivered with a smile. 4 months of her friends coming over at 2 in the afternoon while I was on deadline calls. 4 months of Gavin always said you spent too much time on that computer. A sentence I was never supposed to challenge because what was I going to do? Argue with her about what Gavin said to her privately. She picked up one of the pages, squinted at it, set it back down wrong side up. "These are due in 6 hours, I said. She opened the fridge. "We're out of the good orange juice again. Did you order groceries?" I stood there with my coffee going cold in my hand and I thought, this is the moment. This is the moment right here where everything changes or nothing ever does. I said nothing. I picked up my blueprints. I went back to my studio and I locked the door. That night, Gavin came home and Felicity told him I'd been cold all day. He sat across from me at dinner and said, "She's going through a hard time, Sarah. Can you just try?" 3 years earlier, I would have apologized. I know that about myself now. Instead, I said, "Gavin, your sister threw my project files on the floor this morning." She didn't throw them. They were on the floor. She probably bumped them. You know how small that hallway is. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, "Okay," and cleared my plate and went back to finish my drawings. Here is what neither of them knew. The project on those blueprints was not a small freelance job. It was a contract with Meridian Properties, one of the larger commercial real estate developers in southern Ontario. They were retrofitting a heritage building in downtown Hamilton, 6 floors, load-bearing walls that hadn't been touched since 1962, and they had hired me specifically because of a structural assessment I'd published 2 years ago that apparently made the rounds in the right offices. The contract was worth more than Gavin's annual salary. I had not mentioned this at home because, honestly, it had never felt safe to. Felicity's comments about my work had been low-grade and constant since she arrived. "That hobby of yours? Gavin carries this family. I'd absorbed them the way you absorb cold weather. You don't argue with it, you just try not to freeze." But that morning with the blueprints on the floor, something in me recalibrated. I went back to my studio. I finished the drawings. I submitted them at 11:37 p.m., 13 minutes before deadline. The project manager at Meridian set back a single line. "Perfect. Phase 2 brief coming Monday." I sat in the dark for a while after that, just breathing. Monday came, then Tuesday. Then the following Saturday, when Felicity decided that my studio, my locked studio, would be the perfect place for her and 2 friends to have a quiet brunch because the living room got too much sun in the morning. I came home from a site visit to find my drafting table pushed against the wall and 3 women eating avocado toast in the middle of my workspace. "Sarah," Felicity said brightly, "we were just saying we never get to see you. Sit down." My drafting pencils had been moved. My reference binders were stacked on the floor to make room for a cheese board. I stood in the doorway and I looked at all of it, and I felt very, very calm. That particular kind of calm that only comes when you've been angry for so long that the anger stops feeling like fire and starts feeling like ice. Felicity, I said, I need you to take your things and your guests and leave this room. She laughed a little, not meanly, just like I'd said something slightly absurd. We're almost done. Now, please. Her friends exchanged a look. Felicity's smile went thin. This is Gavin's house too, Sierra. It is, I said, and I'm sure he'd want to hear how his house became a brunch venue on a work day. One of her friends started quietly gathering her jacket. Felicity stood up slowly, the way people do when they want you to understand they're leaving on their own terms. She looked at me with something I hadn't seen from her before, not contempt exactly, more like reassessment. They left. I closed the door. I put my drafting pencils back in order. I sat down and I opened my laptop and I stayed very still for about 10 minutes, just letting my hands stop shaking. That evening, Gavin came home and Felicity had clearly gotten there first. He came into the studio without knocking. She says you embarrassed her in front of her friends. I swiveled my chair to face him. She had 3 people in my workspace. She moved my equipment. She didn't think you'd be back until later. This is my office, Gavin. Would it be okay if I set up a barbecue in your office at the firm? That's different. How? He paused. He did that thing where he runs his hand through his hair and looks at the ceiling, which I have learned over 4 years means he does not have an answer, but he is buying time to find one that sounds like one. She's had a rough year, he finally said. I know she has. I've been very patient about that. I need you to also be patient about me. He looked at me and I looked at him and I could feel the exact shape of the silence between us. He didn't say anything more. He went to make dinner. Felicity did not apologize. What happened next, I didn't plan. I want to be clear about that. I was not sitting in my studio scheming. I was working. I was always just working. About 3 weeks after the brunch incident, I was reviewing property documents for the Meridian Project, chain of title, zoning variances, that kind of administrative reading, when I came across something that stopped me cold. There was a business registration tied to our home address. Not Gavin's business, not mine. A numbered company registered in Ontario, listed at our address, with Felicity's name as sole director. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time. I know what a numbered company is. In Canada, it's legal to register a business at a residential address. What is not legal is using a registered business address for certain types of activity without the knowledge and consent of the property owner. And Gavin and I owned this home. Felicity did not. I pulled the registration records. The company had been registered 2 months after she moved in. It listed our address as both the business address and the mailing address for all official correspondence. I sat with that information for 4 days. I talked to no one about it. On the 5th day, I called a friend from university, Petra, who had gone into corporate law and was now with a mid-size firm in Toronto. We had coffee over video call, the way we always did, and I walked her through what I'd found without giving her names. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Serena, that's unauthorized commercial use of a private residential address. If you didn't consent and you're the property owner, you have standing. What kind of standing? At minimum, you can demand the registration be changed. At maximum, depending on what the company's actually doing, you could have a case for damages. I thanked her. I hung up. I sat in my studio in the November dark and I thought about Felicity saying, this is Gavin's house too. I thought about her friends in my workspace. I thought about the blueprints on the floor. I thought about Gavin saying she didn't think you'd be back until later. I opened a new document. I began to write everything down. Dates, incidents, what was said, what was moved, what was assumed. I went back through my email and found the thread where Felicity had originally asked to stay, where Gavin had replied to both of us. Just a couple months. I screenshot it. I made a folder. Then I waited. I waited because I wanted to be sure. I wanted to have not just standing, but clarity about what I was asking for, about who these people were to me when it mattered, about whether Gavin would surprise me. He did not surprise me. The thing that happened was a Sunday dinner in late November. Gavin's parents drove in from Guelph. Lovely people, I want to say that. They had always been kind to me, and we all sat around the table, and Felicity, in the course of conversation, mentioned that she was starting a little business. Her mother lit up. Her father nodded approvingly. "What kind of business?" I asked, pleasantly. Felicity glanced at me. "Just briefly. Resale, vintage goods, nothing big yet." "That's exciting," I said. "Where are you operating from?" Another glance. "Just online for now." "And the business address for the registration?" The table went a little quiet. Gavin looked at me, not warmly. Felicity said smoothly, still sorting that out. I said, and I smiled and passed the bread. After dinner, while the dishes were being done, Gavin followed me into the kitchen and said quietly, "What was that?" "What was what?" "The interrogation." I asked about her business. "You were making a point." I looked at him. "Gavin, did you know she registered a company at our address?" He went very still, and in that stillness, in the exact quality of it, I had my answer. He knew. He had known. "It's just an address," he said. "It's our address, our home, our property taxes, our legal exposure if that company does anything." "She's not doing anything wrong, Sarah. She's selling vintage jackets online. Then she can list a P.O. box." "You're being." "I'm being what?" He didn't finish the sentence, but I heard it anyway. "Difficult, unreasonable. The woman who makes things hard for no reason." I dried my hands on the dish towel. I folded it neatly over the oven handle. I said, "I'd like her to change the registration by the end of the month." Gavin looked at me like I'd become someone he didn't recognize. "I'm not going to tell my sister." "Then I will." I walked back into the living room and I sat down across from Felicity and I said calmly in front of his parents, "Felicity, I found the business registration at our address. I need you to update it to a different address by December 1st. The silence was the kind that has weight. Her mother looked at her son. Her father set down his cup. Felicity's face went through several expressions very quickly: surprise, calculation, then something that landed on wounded. "I didn't think it would be a problem," she said. "It is a problem," I said without apology. Gavin said my name like a warning. I looked at him and something in me went very quiet and very decided. "Gavin," I said, "she is using our legal address for commercial purposes without our consent. That's not a family disagreement. That's a legal issue." Felicity's mother reached over and touched her daughter's hand. "Felicity, honey, if Serena is uncomfortable." "She's not uncomfortable," Gavin said. She's being clear," his mother said gently. I had not expected that. I don't think Gavin had either. He looked at his mother and something shifted in the room. Felicity changed the registration address 4 days later. She moved it to a Canada Post box in the east end of the city. She did not apologize. She also did not speak to me for 2 weeks, which, I will be honest, was not the punishment she intended it to be. In January, she moved out. Not because I forced her to, I want to be precise about this, but because Gavin finally sat her down and told her the truth. The truth being that the original couple of months had become nearly 5, and that the situation at home was no longer working for his marriage, and that she was capable of paying rent somewhere because she was now running a small business and doing reasonably well. She cried. She told him I had made her feel unwelcome. He called me into the room, which I think he thought would be a conversation, and which turned out to be a moment of something else entirely. Because I said, "Felicity, I didn't make you feel unwelcome. I asked you to respect my workspace and my property. Those are different things." She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "You've never liked me." I didn't dislike you until you started treating my home like your own. I would have felt that way about anyone. She moved into a place in Stony Creek in February. She and Gavin talk on the phone twice a week. We are civil when we see each other, which is 3 or 4 times a year. Gavin and I had a harder road. The weeks after Felicity left were quiet in the way that rooms are quiet after something breaks in them. He was not angry at me exactly. He was something more complicated than that. Grieving, maybe, or recalibrating. He had built a version of our life where keeping the peace meant I absorbed what needed absorbing, and that version didn't exist anymore. One evening in March, he sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "I didn't know about the registration when she first did it. When did you find out?" A pause. "She mentioned it in passing, a few weeks before you brought it up at dinner. And you didn't tell me." "I didn't think it was a big deal." I looked at him. Gavin. We could have been liable for any tax issue, any dispute, any regulatory problem that company touched. Do you understand that? I understand that now. I need you to have understood it then. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I thought you'd overreact." I breathed in. I breathed out. "You thought I'd overreact," I repeated slowly, "to a legal risk to our home. I thought you'd use it as ammunition against her." Did I? He looked at me. "No," he said finally. "You were pretty fair about it." I was completely fair about it. Another pause. "Yeah," he said, "you were." That conversation was the beginning of something different between us. Not easy, easier isn't the right word either. More honest, maybe. He started telling me things instead of managing me. I started saying directly what I needed instead of absorbing until I couldn't. It took time. We're still working on it. But the house is mine again in all the ways that matter. The Meridian project wrapped in April. Phase 2 had expanded into a full structural consultation for 3 additional properties in their portfolio. I brought in the junior engineer to help with the load analysis. We delivered on time. The project manager sent a handwritten card. I framed it. It's on the wall of my studio now, above the drafting table. My sister-in-law thought that because I worked quietly, I wasn't working. She thought that because I didn't fight loudly, I had nothing worth fighting for. She thought my home was available because I wasn't the kind of person who would say it wasn't. I am, though. I always was. I just hadn't needed to say it out loud until she made me. Now she has a P.O. box, and I have the table. I didn't win anything the night Felicity changed her business registration. There was no moment that felt like triumph. She moved it to a P.O. box. Gavin went quiet, and I made dinner like it was any other Tuesday. That's the part nobody tells you about standing your ground. It mostly just looks like a regular evening. But I've been thinking about what actually happened in those 5 months, and I think it comes down to something simple. The way we treat other people's lives tends to return to us, one way or another, not as punishment, not as some cosmic settling of scores, just as consequence. Felicity walked into my home and decided without asking that my work wasn't real, that my space wasn't mine, that the rules applied differently to her, and every single one of those decisions came back around. Not because I arranged it that way, because that's just how things tend to go when you build on assumptions that aren't yours to make. What I keep coming back to is the question of what it actually takes to handle something like that well. Because I didn't handle it perfectly. There were weeks where I said nothing when I should have spoken, and there were moments where I was sharper than I needed to be. But the thing that kept me from making it worse, from blowing up the marriage, from screaming at a family dinner, from doing something I couldn't take back, was that I made myself slow down and think before I moved. When I found that business registration, I sat with it for 4 days. I called Petra. I made a folder. I built a case not because I wanted to win an argument, but because I wanted to be right before I said I was. That discipline, the willingness to pause when everything in you wants to react, is the only reason the outcome looked the way it did. And then there's Gavin. I've thought a lot about the moment he told me he'd known about the registration and hadn't said anything because he thought I'd overreact. That hurt more than anything Felicity did, honestly, because Felicity was a guest behaving badly. Gavin was my partner choosing management over honesty. The difference between those two things matters. What I've learned is that the people who care about you have a responsibility to tell you the truth even when it's inconvenient, and you have the same responsibility back. We're doing better at that now. Not perfectly, but better. And that came from me being willing to say clearly what I needed, even when the room went cold, even when it cost me something to say it. I think about that a lot when I sit in my studio now. The one with the card from the project manager framed above the drafting table. Nobody gave me that contract because I was likable or easy to be around. They gave it to me because I did the work. Quietly, consistently, for years, even when the people in my own home couldn't see it. There's something in that worth holding on to. The idea that you don't have to be loud about what you're building, you just have to keep building it. The results tend to speak clearly enough on their own. Felicity has a P.O. box. I have the table. And I think that's about right.